I'm just going to start off with a little story just to sort of set the scene. It's about when I was very young in my career, and I was trying to make that transition from being a homeless ex-service user who'd done quite well into like being a professional person. And I worked for an organisation called the Safe the Middlesbrough Partnership, and I had to do some work on counter-terrorism and the prevent agenda and things like that. And it's like I had to do a presentation at the town hall in front of the mayor, and this was like a massive deal for me. We used to call our mayor Robocop, you know what I mean? He was a big deal. So I prepared and I prepared and I prepared and I prepared some more, and I got on and I did my presentation, and halfway through I thought, you're smashing this, Bruce. You're doing all right here. And I absolutely nailed it. And then, I don't know whether any of you deliver training, but we're all very sort of ego sensitive. You always go for the feedback forms at the end, don't you? Straight to the feedback form, see what everyone thought. And the first one I picked up said, really good presentation, but your flies are open. And it wasn't just that my flies were open, like I'd borrowed a top that was too big for me and it kind of pushed itself out through the hole. It was like waffing around. So no matter how much we prepare, no matter how well intentioned we are, sometimes the metaphorical skirt is tucked in your knickers and you don't know. And I think we can take some of that for the theme of this conference. We've got to make the system work for people. We've got to unpick the things that aren't working, and we've got to come up with the solutions for things that are. So that's a common theme throughout the day, really, and an embarrassing story never goes amiss in a conference, does it? So I'll introduce our first speaker now. Ruth is the Chief Executive of Shelter Cymru, and I've got a big blurb here about all the stuff that she's done. It'd probably be easier to talk about the things that she hasn't done in relation to supporting people and fighting to end homelessness. So started out with a local authority, with housing associations, homeless services in Cardiff and London, and then ran a women's refuge and a teenage mother and baby unit for a black-led housing association. Absolutely awesome stuff. So Ruth joined Shelter Cymru as CEO during the pandemic, which is no easy challenge, and has made a considerable impact since she arrived. So she chairs the Homes for All Cymru, and she sits on the Ending Homelessness National Advisory Board, and she's going to give us some context for the conference. Like I said, everyone clap, it's nice.
Hi, really pleased to be here. I feel like this is my transition today from having a virtual job to having a real job, being out and seeing people, so great to be here. Thanks very much to Lindsay, to our sponsors, and to everybody who's contributing today. And this is my chance as well to say thank you to all the people in the background who've made today happen. So, Borodar, firstly, I just want to sort of set the scene for you and talk a little bit about what makes Shelter Cymru distinctive before I do a little tour of how I see things at present. So, I've not been with Shelter Cymru long enough to feel self-conscious about saying that it's an absolutely brilliant organisation. Three of the things that make it distinctive are the level of expertise. So we provide free, independent housing advice, which is quality assured by the Legal Aid Agency. Second thing I want to mention is our reach. We've got tremendous reach. With our funds from Welsh Government and others, we provide services in every local authority in Wales. We last year helped 1 in every 135 households in Wales access our help. So our reach is very considerable. And what that means is that our policy and campaigning work is rooted in deep and wide experience of housing need in Wales. So those are three of the things that I think hope help to understand and position us well, I suppose, to contribute to the debate with yourselves today. I'm going to talk about these three things. I'm going to dwell on where we are now. I'm going to say a little bit about what's on the horizon. And then I'm going to very briefly talk about a call to action, because I think there can't be a Shelter Cymru presentation without a call to action. So starting with where we are now. In order to solve the housing emergency that we face, it's important that we take stock really of our starting point. I'm going to talk a little bit about housing options and homelessness and where I see we are now. And in starting to think about this, for me, I was thinking about the kind of euphemism being a kind of an agreeable substitute for a term that's less desirable. And housing options feels like it fits into that category for me. Certainly the people we help don't feel like they have housing options. It doesn't capture their experience. Their choices are constrained. They're constrained by their income. They're constrained by the lack of affordable housing. And they're constrained by the absolutely immense pressure that there is on the system that many of you work in. So talking that through a little bit more, owner occupation, these are the people really who are exercising the highest degree of choice in the current system. A subset of owner occupiers are even in a position where they can purchase additional properties. They may have access to developments which are for holiday homes only. So that's where the choice sits. For people who don't have access to owner occupation, social housing is often the preferred form of tenure. But we know that social housing is in really short supply. So there are around 230,000 social homes in Wales today, but we also know that we've got around 68,000 people at the last count on housing waiting lists in Wales. So that 20,000 social homes that Welsh Government is committed to is incredibly welcome, but we are dealing with a long-term legacy of underinvestment in social housing. So what that means in reality is that social housing and accessing it is less about choice than it is about a high-stakes competition to access social housing, where there are various barriers and exclusion criteria and sometimes homelessness tests that need to be navigated in order to get access to social housing. We did a report a few years ago in Swansea on the allocations process. What that really highlighted was how frustrating it was for individuals to be able to access social housing with multiple different routes, with uncoordinated approach to waiting lists across social housing providers. There are also barriers like former tenants' arrears policies, which make it difficult for some people to access accommodation. Being person-centred must surely mean that we acknowledge really what we know about people. So what we know is that people face hardship, we know that people make mistakes, we know that people carry trauma. People do these things, tenants do these things. We need a person-centred housing system that acknowledges that all of those people still need homes. In this vein, we're going to be doing some work building on our ending evictions into homelessness work to look further at managing antisocial behaviour and researching alternatives to managing antisocial behaviour that provide a better route than the route we currently have, where we see our housing solicitors defending injunctions and evictions for some of the most vulnerable people that use our services. That takes us to the private rented sector. The role of the private rented sector has changed considerably in recent years. And as owner occupation and social housing have become pipe dreams for many, it's needed to fulfil a very different role. So those people who benefited from the flexibility that it offers are only part of the market for the private rented sector now. The private rented sector is also accommodating families, it's accommodating elderly people, it's accommodating people with really complex needs. The people we work with would tend not to choose a private rented sector as their tenure of choice. They would choose a tenure that was more affordable, they would choose a tenure that gave them more security. So increasingly the private rented sector is a tenure of last resort. And once we acknowledge, there are some steps in the right direction in terms of the Welsh Government's new leasing scheme Wales, which takes us in that direction of affordability and in that direction of security. It's a problematic sector for many of the reasons that I've outlined. About 45% of our casework comes from the private rented sector, and that can be things like no-fault evictions, disrepair, disputes between landlord and tenant, including harassment. So it generates a certain amount of casework for us. And what we also know is that the costs in the private rented sector have escalated considerably. So over the last 12 months, other than in London, Wales has topped the list in terms of price increases in the private rented sector. So it's increasingly unaffordable. And we know from the work, for example, by the Bevan Foundation, about the real challenges, if you're reliant on local housing allowance, the real challenges of being able to identify properties which are affordable to be able to access. We did a survey recently with landlords, which we did in partnership with Rent Smart Wales, and that threw up some really interesting findings. It threw up some really good practice. It threw up some great examples of landlords working really positively with their tenants and to provide access and support them through the pandemic. It also threw up some examples about the additional barriers that some people face in trying to access accommodation in an area which is already often the tenure of last resort. So what landlords told us in that survey was that around half of landlords would prefer not to or would not let their properties to people who had been homeless. What we found was that approaching a third of landlords would prefer not to or would not let accommodation to households who were partly dependent on benefits for their weekly income. And what we also found was that discrimination on grounds of protected characteristics is alive and kicking in the private rented sector in Wales. So for all of those reasons, that tenure of last resort is not necessarily easy to access. That leads us onto homelessness in all of its various forms. So approaching 7,800 people were in temporary accommodation at the end of March. There's a bottleneck in temporary accommodation that still persists. So the latest figures in March show that it continues that more people flow into temporary accommodation each month than flow out to temporary accommodation. And the latest figures, Welsh Government figures for March, show that was a 2-to-1 ratio, more than a 2-to-1 ratio of people flowing into temporary accommodation as opposed to the numbers flowing out in the same period. We're going to be reissuing our temporary accommodation survival guide because there are many people struggling today with living with the deprivation and the indignity and the lack of privacy of living in temporary accommodation. There's a growing number of local authorities as well that have waiting lists for temporary accommodation, so people are unable to access their right to temporary accommodation. They are left on waiting lists which are essentially unlawful. In the current situation, temporary accommodation feels like another euphemism. So we know from another why we did that temporary accommodation is not measured in days and weeks, it's measured in months, and it's sometimes measured in a period of over a year in Wales at present. And that can be why people are waiting for longer term or settled accommodation. And that longer term or settled accommodation needs to last for 6 months or more. So we're in a crazy sort of topsy-turvy world of temporary and permanent accommodation that really isn't serving people's needs. This overview that I've kind of given here, it's not intended in any way to be a criticism of all of us who are working really hard within this broken system. It's just really intended to recognise that people in Wales commonly don't have choice in terms of their housing, and what that means is that many are stuck in conditions in which they and their households fail to thrive, and that can have lifelong impacts upon them. Just going to focus on homelessness for the next 3 slides. What I'm thinking about here really is we're in an interesting position in Wales. We have an enormously positive sort of starting point in that there is a widely shared ambition to end homelessness. There is a plan to end homelessness, to make it rare, brief and unrepeated. And that plan has been developed by Welsh Government in genuine collaboration with the sector. That is a very positive position for us to be in. It feels that's pulling in one direction. Pulling in the other direction is the system capacity, the very real problems that we're experiencing today. Realising that plan is incredibly challenging. What system capacity actually means it's difficult for people, as I said, to even uphold their current rights at present. And stuck in the middle of that is a quote really from one of our service user, which really just summarises, I suppose, how fundamentally people can't get on with their lives when they're living in temporary accommodation. This is somebody not asking much, really describing how they can't just get by, let alone plan a positive future. And it's that which is the driver really. It's the voices of people who are experiencing that hardship that the driver we must have in squaring this circle of dealing with that absolutely positive ambition that exists and squaring the circle of how does that work with the system capacity that we currently have. This illustrates the trajectory in terms of local authorities' relief of homelessness outcomes and the prevention outcomes. And you can see that they've been increasingly divergent. In some ways, obviously, this is unsurprising. We've been through a pandemic, there are incredible pressures, but what it shows is that we're still in a system which is very much in crisis. We see this in our casework, where people tell us that they've approached a local authority, but they've been told to come back at the point at which they have a court order for eviction, because there simply isn't the capacity to assist. It took an absolutely huge effort, clearly, to get everybody in, and an absolutely huge effort to sustain services through the pandemic. But it certainly feels like now is the time to double down efforts in terms of prevention and to refocus on prevention. And also to explore new approaches to prevention. So we're really pleased to be working with Denbighshire Council in terms of an early intervention project in partnership with Clwyd Allen and Warm Wales too. And what that will aim to do is to look at a multi-agency approach to early intervention, to getting upstream in terms of homelessness prevention. And then lastly on homelessness, just to highlight outcomes for people in temporary accommodation. So as I say, what we do know is a tremendous amount of positive work has been done. You see there, about 30% of people who moved into long-term accommodation is a reflection of no insignificant effort. It's also rather worrying though to notice that people who left temporary accommodation with an unknown outcome, a similar proportion of people left temporary accommodation and we don't know where they are. We don't know what's not working here. We don't know what the implications are for those individuals. We don't know what the implications are for services. And what this really tells us is that there's a lot that we don't know at the moment about where we are, and that we do need to understand better to plan a way forward. Turning to the second element, so just looking forward to what's on the horizon, I'm going to talk briefly about homelessness reform and reform for renters. So in terms of homelessness legislation, we know that we have current consultation in terms of interim proposals from Welsh Government around homelessness, and then we've got a more fundamental review, a more fundamental legislative review to look forward to as well. From Shelter Cymru's point of view, we really welcome the proposed addition of rough sleeping to priority need categories as an interim measure. But ultimately, we are looking forward to a legislative approach that doesn't rely upon a test of priority need. We're more concerned about the greater freedom of, that local authorities, it's proposed, will have around unsuitable temporary accommodation for people. We're concerned because, going back to the last slide, we've got a lot of people falling out of temporary accommodation. And that this could exacerbate that situation. I'll also give you an example of one of the reasons it concerns me, which is in one of our caseworkers meeting, I remember a case being described whereby a family was being placed by a local authority in temporary accommodation, and they were asked whether they were going to take that temporary accommodation up, and advised that if they took up the temporary accommodation, the same local authority would be advising its children's social care department that the children were at risk in that accommodation. Now, those are the kinds of choices that nobody should have to make. In terms of looking forward to the legislative review, as I say, we're some distance at the moment from the kind of system that we would like to see. So we're very much in a system of gatekeeping, and what we look forward to is a system which is about enabling people to access housing. So our litmus tests for a future system will be whether people feel that system works for them, and whether it treats them in the way that they should be treated when they're trying to access a fundamental human need of a home. There's scope for more work to do. We're concerned at the moment about people in temporary accommodation. All of us are feeling the cost of living crisis to different degrees. People who are living with the most basic facilities, forced to spend their low income, in many cases, on microwave meals, to share a microwave with 50 to 100 people trying to keep a nutritious food on the table for a family. There's a real argument for more financial help for people who are really at the sharp end there. We also clearly need to have a more affordable settled homes in order to facilitate the rapid rehousing, because a change in legislation will mean very little unless we can move forward with rapid rehousing and get people into homes. And we also need that consistency, that intensity of support, that flexibility to ensure that people are not just being found homes, but are genuinely being supported to keep them. In terms of the second area on the horizon, reform for tenants. The two headlines there are the Rent and Home Wales Act and the commitment from Welsh Government to explore rent regulation. Clearly we were disappointed by the deferral of implementation of the Rented Homes Wales Act, and that delay works for landlords, but it certainly doesn't work for tenants. We're looking forward clearly to the benefits that the Act is intended to deliver, not least in terms of protection from retaliatory eviction and enforcement of fitness for human habitation. Our litmus test here, so we go into rent regulation, for example, we're very committed to an evidence-informed approach, and we will be doing some monitoring and evaluation of the Rented Home Wales Act to ensure that the expected benefits are realised in practice. But we want to go further, and clearly the deferral provides a greater opportunity really to go further now, the deferral of implementation. So we will very much be arguing for, and are arguing for, an extension of the 6-month notice period for no-fault evictions. We want that to apply not just to new tenants, but to existing tenants, and we think that could make a really important contribution to homelessness prevention. We've sought independent legal opinion in this regard, and that is supportive of the move to a blanket 6-month notice period for all no-fault evictions from December. So that's a dialogue that we're very much continuing with Welsh Government at present. Ultimately, though we're more ambitious and we'd like to see an end to no-fault eviction, it's not a comfortable position for Wales, which is normally so progressive, to be behind Scotland and England in terms of thinking about ending no-fault eviction. We'll be working with the Renters Reform Coalition to press for an end to no-fault eviction and other important rights. And lastly, just to mention that point about upholding people's rights. Having rights in law is meaningless if they can't be exercised. During the programme today, you will hear quite a lot from people about the challenges and the opportunities in terms of enforcing tenants' rights. Among some of the work that we've been doing over the last year has been working with the police, for example, to ensure there's better awareness that illegal eviction is a criminal offence, to enable people, again, to have a better opportunity to be able to enforce their rights. Lastly, and briefly, call to action. So 3 main calls to action from me today. Firstly, last year's conference, we focused very much on these systemic drivers of the housing emergency. The story remains quite similar. We need to tackle these systemic drivers, and fundamentally, as a society, we need to have a belief that houses are primarily there as homes. That is the function of houses, is homes, not as commodities to be traded. Secondly, I believe we need to ask some candid questions, and that's about us asking questions of ourselves and asking questions of others. Some of those questions are here. You'll have many others that will occur to you throughout the day and that you'll already be carrying with you as key questions that we need to answer. I'm just picking out one of them, the question about being guided by data and evidence. It feels quite trite, but actually can be really challenging. So in our Housing First project in Gwynedd, for example, we're working with social landlords who perhaps have people referred to them to do a Housing First project, who are seeking accommodation, whose names may be well known to them and many other local agencies, who may be seen as problematic and challenging, who may have very chaotic housing histories. But the evidence tells us if we give them a tenancy and the opportunity to succeed, and we offer that wraparound support, the evidence tells us that there is every chance that tenancy will be successful. Sometimes it's very hard and uncomfortable to follow the evidence, and we need to have the courage to follow the evidence. And then lastly, we need to choose our pandemic legacy. And I think this one for me is really important. We've all been through what we hope is a sort of once-in-a-lifetime experience. How we come out of it, I think, will be quite telling in terms of our priorities. So I've talked about some of the erosion of rights that we've seen during the pandemic. That could be our legacy, that we erode our rights-based culture in Wales. But we can choose another legacy. There's been a wide acceptance during the pandemic that home, is fundamental to all of us. There's been a much more widespread intolerance of rough sleeping and homelessness that we can kind of capitalise on. That gives us a real opportunity. In September, we will, with Tai Pow and the Chartered Institute of Housing Wales, we will be launching a report, which is a cost-benefit analysis undertaken by Alma Economics on our behalf, into introducing the right to adequate housing. We think that could be a really fitting legacy, so that future generations in Wales will be able to look back and say that in the context of a public health emergency, in the context of an ongoing homelessness and housing emergency, that we chose the legacy of introducing the right to adequate housing in Wales. And what that would do is hardwire the commitment to end homelessness into law. It would take us into a commitment for homelessness that lasts beyond a Senedd term. It would enable us to think long term. And it would consolidate all of the really excellent work that's been done already. It would drive future law, future policy, future investment in the right direction to progressively, and that's the key word, progressively, it won't happen overnight, to progressively realise the right to adequate in housing so that everybody in Wales ultimately has access to a good home. The bottom line in terms of choosing that legacy for me really is about putting housing and homelessness in its rightful place, which is about putting it at the centre of social justice and improvements of social justice in Wales. So I trust that you will join us on that journey and that call to action in terms of the right to adequate housing, and I'll hand back to Lindsay.
Thank you, Ruth, for that presentation. Is anybody feeling inspired by that? That wasn't a rhetorical question. Is anyone feeling inspired by that?
Yeah.
No, come on. Right. I think that just highlights there's a lot to do. There's a lot to do. But I don't think this is a sad story. If you'd have asked me before the pandemic if homelessness could be solved, I'd have said if I see it in my lifetime, I'll die a happy woman. Since the pandemic, actually, I do think we've got a fighting chance. I think we've got a fighting chance at cracking this if we do get our head around what it is that we need to do and put the same level of commitment behind it as we saw during the pandemic.